So I think everyone in here is pretty familiar with the concept that we are currently in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. We're experiencing widespread and dramatic declines in wild populations and wild species. And this graph up here shows the decline in vertebrate wildlife abundances over about the last 50 years. But this decline is also occurring for invertebrates and plants as well. And such is the extent of these losses that we are currently in the midst of a global mass extinction event. And this can really threaten humanity. Wildlife is an important source of food and income for over 1 billion people that fish or hunt for their livelihoods. Wildlife can perform important ecological functions, and biodiversity in general can help increase productivity in agricultural systems and aid in all sorts of ecological services, including pollination and water provision. So in response to this, the international community came together at the Conference of Parties in 2022 and created the Global Biodiversity Framework. And within this framework, they committed to conserving 30% of the world's terrestrial and inland and marine waterways in protected areas by 2030. And this is colloquially known as 30 by 30. And while this is a very laudable and ambitious goal, how to achieve it in practice remains incredibly elusive. One of the reasons for that is that protected areas across the planet, especially in the tropics and especially in the global south, face a lot of problems. They face security challenges, they face inadequate technical resources, and especially a lot of a dearth of funding, a lot of issues related to funding. And I'm going to transition us here to talking about Africa, because in Africa, there is a potential solution for this. There is an increasing trend in Africa for national governments to partner with nonprofit, non-governmental organizations in what are called collaborative management models. And in these management models, NGOs are delegated complete authority to manage and govern national parks on the behalf of African governments. And this is a big deal. In part because it's just increasing to such an extent, but also because these NGOs, through these collaborative management models, have the potential to fill these shortcomings that have been plaguing protected area management over the last several decades. At the same time, though, there are some concerns. One is that NGOs could lack legitimacy in local contexts. Another is that they could be prone to using militarized conservation efforts. And such efforts could exacerbate actually political violence. A lot of these nonprofits operate in conflict zones. And this could also perpetuate colonial era power dynamics. And I wanted to explore, along with some colleagues, people you know, Patrick Honeycutt and Gabe Englander, for those of you who know them, what are the outcomes of this shift in protected area management from privatized management in Africa on both not only wildlife, but also people. The anecdotes appear to make it seem that it's working for wildlife, but we were especially concerned too what might be the impacts on people. To explore this question, we used the case study of African parks. And some of you have heard about African parks from me now quite a bit. African Parks is a South African-based non-governmental organization whose mission is to conserve, restore, and connect wildlife across Africa. And African Parks, their scope is continental, and their interventions and really their goals are extremely ambitious. Another key aspect about them is that law enforcement is their top priority. But they also seek to maximize benefits for people. And as a consequence, this organization, due to the scale of their ambition, the extent of their pockets, they're supported by the European Union, by the United States Agency for International Development, by the World Bank, and quite a few billionaires. Prince Harry is the president, so a local, which is kind of fun. They have the potential to really actually make some like extremely significant, substantial progress in restoring Africa's wildlife. They undertake projects that include translocating 500 elephants or 2,000 large mammals. And as a result, they are a real serious force in African wildlife conservation, and they're likely to be in the long term. They typically partner with governments, with national governments in Africa on average to manage and really govern their protected areas for about 20 years. And within that time span, they really act like nation states. They even provide food security or food aid during emergency disasters. But again, they also seek to maximize the benefits for local people. And for all this reason, African parks really encompasses these potential trade-offs inherent in private management, or the potential benefits, but also the potential costs. And that's also because they do use militarized conservation. The photos that I showed you before were of African parks for interest. Their footprint is also growing. And so I'm trying to just sort of paint a picture here that there's this organization out there that is becoming increasingly powerful in Africa that very few people know about. To give you a sense of the scale, these little red dots are the current protected areas that they manage. They currently manage 22 protected areas. But they have this ambition to maybe even manage 90. And those are all of the yellow sites. They call those their anchor sites. There's actually 161 of them, but 90 that they've identified as being suitable for their interests. So some of you know this, but I actually reached out to African Parks because I was like, hey, I'm really interested in what you're doing. And also maybe there might be some potential unintended consequences going on here, but I appreciate your vision. And I think that we could maybe work together to move things in the right direction. And they said like, yeah, sounds good. And Patrick and I were like, oh my God, great. And then we stopped hearing from them a little bit. And then we basically kind of got ghosted by African Parks. And we were told later, we didn't really understand quite what they were doing. And we were like, I think we understand a little too much what you're doing. Anyway, so I would really want to believe that African Parks has this potential, and I want to believe in its mission. But is it working, and what are the impacts? And if there are unintended impacts, how can we reduce them? So we decided eventually to just go ahead and do this project anyway, even without African Parks' support. And we use a recently developed dynamic difference in differences estimator. And then we also took advantage of two key features of our study system. And one of those was the staggered transference of protected areas to African Parks management over the last 20 or so years. So again, they currently manage 22 parks, and this is their accumulation at different points in time. We also took advantage of their anchor sites. So one of the key feature of a quasi-experimental design is creating a valid counterfactual. And so what we did is we actually recreated their map of the sites that they have identified are of interest to them, but that they do not currently manage to use as a counterfactual. And we're actually able to get a little bit of information about them to confirm that those features at those sites are similar to those in the parks that they currently manage. So in this map here, we just have the red sites that have been managed by African Parks and the purple sites that have not yet been. And basically, we controlled the outcomes. We tested for the outcomes, several different outcomes related to people and wildlife in our treated African Park sites over time compared to the outcomes over the same time periods in our counterfactual controlled sites. And this is a lot of information, but this is what we did. In order to try to get a sense of the outcomes of this, we had to draw on a lot of different databases and really kind of do our best to figure out what we could get our hands on. And what we were able to test were for impacts on elephant poaching. For that, we used the monitoring of illegally killed elephants database. We tested for impacts on bird abundances by using eBird. For tourism, we couldn't get actual information on tourism, so we used data proxies from eBird and iNaturalist. We wanted to look at wealth, the potential impacts on wealth in the communities surrounding these parks. So we used Atlas AI. Then we also wanted to look at armed conflict, and I'll explain that just a little bit more. But we used the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And then we also wanted to see if we could try to figure out how any outcomes that we observed, like what the mechanism was. And for that, we used the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, which has a series of different scores for protected area management. So what did we find? First, and maybe I'll move through this pretty quickly here. We also just wanted to compare the certain features of our control sites, of our counterfactual sites to our treatment sites. And we found that there was no differences in size, longitude, latitude, and precipitation. There was a difference, though, in some extreme heat events. We also found, though, that in our treatment sites, there was universally worse outcomes. And pre-treatment, I'm trying to fit a lot in here. And we first, you may be wondering, well, if your treatment sites are different than your control sites pre-treatment, is that a problem? And we actually don't really think it is a problem. And that's because this is what we would expect. We would expect that African Parks, who is focused on restoration, to target protected areas that have higher rates of elephant poaching, lower management scores, potentially more armed conflict, less tourism for those reasons, and potentially lower wildlife abundances. Moreover, our interest was not just in comparing whether, or in testing whether African parks could improve protected areas that were at their worst. We really wanted to test whether or not African parks relative to government counterfactual, regardless of whether those sites were managed poorly or successfully, had better or worse outcomes. So we thought we could keep going with this. Here are our results, and for the sake of time, okay, great. Then let me go to this slide. So what we found was that African parks significantly decreased elephant poaching dramatically, and this is like remarkable because a lot of the areas they operate in have really intense armed conflict. We also found an increase in bird abundances, and for that reason, we felt like this created a picture in which African parks does appear to be succeeding in protecting wildlife, particularly in some of the areas where wildlife is most threatened. We also saw an increase in tourism, which was quite interesting. But you might expect that if there was an increase in tourism, and we are considering like the potential economic benefits of African parks management on people, that maybe we would also see a concurrent increase in wealth in communities surrounding African parks. But we actually didn't. We saw no impact on wealth. But we did find one particularly concerning outcome, and that's that and that was related to armed conflict. We found that rebel groups, militias, increased their targeting of civilians in areas outside of African parks sites. And this actually comports with what we know about natural resource extractions, or when you limit rebel groups' access to natural resources. So a lot of militias in Africa, for example, will target elephants for their ivory. And it seemed possible or plausible that by limiting access of militias to ivory, that militias would in turn potentially turn to targeting civilians. This happens outside of diamond mines and things like that. And so we actually did see a statistically significant increase of African parks management on the armed targeting of civilians in areas bordering the park. And so this is likely an unintended impact of their increased monitoring and enforcement strategy. And that's because when we were looking at the management effectiveness scores, we did find that African parks had really much higher monitoring and effectiveness. We also found a few other things though too. There was a non-statistically significant decrease in decision-making inclusiveness. And what does this all mean? Well, it means a few things. Positive outcomes for wildlife, potential economic benefits, maybe through tourism, we're not sure. Concerning impacts on civilians near parks. We found that those were likely attributable to the increases in monitoring and enforcement. This is a really particularly kind of concerning outcome, is that we're seeing increase in monitoring and enforcement, but potentially decreasing decision-making inclusiveness. which is kind of begs the question, is African parks recreating fortress-style conservation in Africa? Finally, there's a lot more to do to understand this. One is that we need to hear from local people. That's something that's really just critically missing from this, just, to a dramatic degree. And then finally, it just, I feel like this study highlights that there are a lot of unintended impacts of conservation, or at least there can be. We do need to better understand them. And that's so that we make, can ensure that we make protected areas, not work not only for Africa's wildlife, but also its people. Thank you.